Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. We're going to have 2 talks and then a break. Our first speaker today is Dr. Viola Konig, and she is the director of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, a position she has held for the past 16 years. Prior to that, she led the Übersee Museum of Ethnology, Natural History, and the History of Trades in Bremen, and the Department of Ethnology in the State Museum of Lower Saxony and Hanover. She was also a curator at the Ethnology Museums of Cologne and Hamburg. Her research interests and scientific focus contribute to the knowledge of 2 geographical regions: Mesoamerican iconography and writing systems, as well as the ethnography and material culture of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. These areas of expertise are reflected in the titles of the international exhibitions she has curated, including Aztecs, which was in Berlin in 2003, the Tropics, Views from the Middle of the Globe, which traveled around the world in between 2008 and 2010, and Native American Modernism, also in Berlin in 2012. She holds honorary professorships for cultural sciences at Bremen University and for Pre-Columbian Studies and Cultural Anthropology at Free University in Berlin. And her awards and honors are much longer than these few sentences, but those are the highlights. Welcome, Dr. Konig.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, or good night, the ones who came with me from Europe. I'm glad to be here at this late night session, and I would like everybody before me, to thank so much to the organizers, the Getty Institution, the CEO, Tom Getjens, Kim Richter, Marissa and Jennifer, and all who are involved in this wonderful conference that had been prepared a long time ago. And I think it was just a great idea and the ever first conference on that topic, I guess. So we are a sort of crazy mixture of speakers, and already in the morning I've learned a lot. And also some things already have been shown and said, and maybe I have to change it a bit and add a bit more other information. I guess I should start with my... An overview of the European landscape shows that there is just one museum, as far as I know about, dealing exclusively with American arts, American prehistory or pre-Columbian history, American ethnology, anthropology, etc. This is the Museo de América in Madrid. I would like to exclude the Karl May Museum at Radebeul, Dresden, which is more on the German reception of Native Americans and the people themselves. However, we do find several museums dedicated to the arts from Asia, for example in Paris or Berlin. The Tervuren in Brussels deals with Africa, while the Musée National des Arts d'Afrique et d'Océanie of Paris was merged into the Musée du Quai Branly in 2003. While the museums on Asiatic art show the recognition of the arts over time and space at the same level as European arts, the Madrid, Brussels, and Paris museums' origin is strongly connected to the ex-colonies in Latin America, Africa, and Oceania. The Turpin Museum Amsterdam also goes back to the Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia and South America. However, individual objects and whole huge collections from the Americas can be found all over Europe, the earliest arriving earlier than museums as institutions have been found. They were byproducts of the import of precious metals and regarded as exotic trade articles. They were shown as proofs and symbols of the European expansion beginning in the 15th century. Most of the surviving objects ended in the Kunstkameras or cabinets of curiosities of the European nobility and royal houses. Works of art and commodity items, they were all regarded as curiosities. Detached of their original cultural context and not understood, they were seen through European eyes, exposed to European projections and religious preconceptions. They served political interests such as showing a nobleman's cosmopolitism, saying, hey, I know about the world. For me, as a pre-Columbian specialist and anthropologist, and trying to understand these objects through native authors' eyes, it is interesting to observe the trend of contemporary art historians today to focus their research on the view through Renaissance European eyes. And I like to encourage the Getty to think about another symposium on such topic, including both sides, and maybe have sort of struggle. So I think both is needed, but I think the native, the decoding of these objects is getting weaker after decades of trying to decode these objects, and now already we have to turn back that they are seen and regarded, interpreted by the people in Europe that received these objects. Again, both is necessary. So again, now at least we see. Well, I want to start with Albrecht Dürer, the German artist Albrecht Dürer, who as early as 1520 already saw the war booty in Brussels that Hernan Cortés had sent to Europe. And he writes, and unfortunately, I didn't translate it, so allow me 4 sentences in German, Old German, Ancient German. Auch habe ich gesehen die Ding, die man dem König aus dem neuen Guldenland gebracht hat. Von allerlei ihrer Waffen, Harnisch, Geschütz, wunderbarlich war, seltsamer Kleidung, Pettgewand und allerlei wunderbarlicher Ding zu manniglichem Brauch, das so viel schöner anzusehen ist, dann Wunderding. It's just an appreciation of these wonderful objects, believe me. Objects from today Latin America were among the first to be held in the Kunstkameras at all. We do not know who actually were this famous penachos from Mexico, which is housed today in the Weltmuseum Vienna or the Ex-Museum für Völkerkunde. It is attested since 1575 in the collections of Archduke Ferdinand Ambras near Innsbruck, Austria. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was deposited in the Museum of Ethnology. The first description is from 1596. It was first shown to the public in the Royal Natural History Hofmuseum in 1878. The penacho is probably the most famous pre-Columbian object to be found in a Kunstkammer. However, there were more and contemporary ones. So I do not want to get into the discussion, but believe me, as a museum person, I don't believe that the reason it cannot be sent back is because they have problems of protections. Talk to Hasenkamp and others. It is possible. It is not maybe to keep peaceful relations between two countries such as Mexico and Austria, and so it's okay for me, but not say these things for conservation reasons it cannot be transferred. It's simply not true. Yeah, 2 more Aztec artworks found their way into the cabinet of curiosities of the Duke of Württemberg in the south of Germany. 2 of 4 worldwide Aztec feather shields and a skeletal figure made of greenstone with inlaid shell. They are believed to have been among the featherwork sent to Europe shortly after the Spanish conquest in 1521. These objects are attested at Stuttgart as early as 1599, forming part of Philipp Heinhofer's Mömpelgarder collection dated something about 1578 to 1646. This wonderful figure shows a number of well-known attributes in the typical Aztec iconography. Among those, 10 calendrical signs, as 10 Kali, 1 Ehrkattel, 1 Osomatli, 1 Kali, 3 Osomatli, 1 Sipakli, 1 Masatl, 1 Kiwawitl, 9 Ehrkattel, 4 Ehrkattel, and 1 Kwautli. I just tell you there's a lot of information in these early objects that tell us a lot of information. The wonderful figure shows not only these calendar signs, but also inside there is a sort of a channel that is quite unique for such type of objects. Maybe it was used for copal. Well, yeah, I'm very proud of this. Enjoy. Among the earliest objects and documents from Mesoamerica sent to Europe were the few pre-Columbian codices which survived the Spanish burnings of native books during and after the conquest. With one exception, they are all distributed over Europe today, among them the Dresden and the Vienna codices. The Codex Guardia, housed today in the Vatican's Apostolic Library, was rediscovered in 1805 by Alexander von Humboldt among the effects of Cardinal Stefano Borgia. Humboldt did understand the value of what he found because he had just come back from Mexico in 1804, bringing with him 16 fragments of early colonial manuscripts in the pre-Columbian style. The acquisition was a result of networking with some of the earliest local collectors and antiquarians, but it was also the beginning of international networking between collectors and scholars. The fragments, however, had originally been brought together to form the first Museo Ignano, planned by Lorenzo Boturini Bernaducci, who lived between 1702 and 1753, an Italian historian, antiquary, and ethnographer of New Spain, who stayed 8 years in New Spain or Mexico, traveling in central Mexico mostly, and assembling a vast collection of paintings, maps, manuscripts, and native codices from descendants of the Aztec rulers. For example, Texcoco, mostly Texcoco. He copied more than 500 pre-Columbian inscriptions and made his own drawings of monuments and sculptures. However, the collection was confiscated by Viceroy Pedro Cebriani Agustin, or Cebrian y Agustin in 1743, and poor Boturini was arrested and sent back to Spain. He got kept by pirates and then arrived almost naked, nothing, at the Spanish coast, and he had a history before coming to New Spain. He had another history after going back to Spain. I cannot tell this. I need another 30 minutes. But one should write a novel out of it, real novel. And the thing with the Aztec princess, a lot about to tell Lorenzo Boturini. So, the collection was confiscated and then more or less neglected in the palace, in the National Palace in Mexico City. And then the collection, or part of the collection, was passed over to several owners when Humboldt arrived just in time in Mexico City. Part of the collection ended in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris. The 16 Humboldt fragments, such as the tribute list from Tlapa Guerrero, seen on this slide, is today housed in the States Library of Berlin with all the others. A second part of this list, this tribute list, was found in Guerrero only 150 years later, or in 1949 in Mexico and Guerrero. It had then another very fascinating story. So I'm trying to resume three stories. Boturini, the local dealers of the Boturini fragments in Mexico when Humboldt came, Aubin and Gama de Leon and Picado and Waldeck, and this is another story. And then the third story would be of the fragments. There's still some fragments missing of the tribute list. So it's all stories and stories and stories. This case shows perfectly how tracing back the collection's origin means following their odyssey and division in Mexico and different parts of Europe, going back and forth and back and forth. I think we heard this morning Rina was already talking about this. While Humboldt got no permission to enter Brazil for political reasons, other Germans did, some of them strongly inspired by Humboldt's example. At the turn of the 18th to the 19th centuries, the general conditions of traveling to and in Brazil were easier compared to other parts of Latin America marked by political unrests, insurrections. Separation and independence from Portugal underwent a totally different process. At the beginning of the 19th century, all ports of Brazil were open to international trade, and foreign skilled workers and specialists were hired to build up the infrastructure of Brazil's huge territory. Many natural scientists, such as botanists, mineralogists, zoologists, medical doctors, etc., especially from Austria and Bavaria, did research and assembled huge collections, not exclusively minerals, plants, and animal specimens, but also ethnographic objects, which found their way into the cabinets of curiosities. As you can see on this slide, some of these, such as featherworks, hunting gear, or hammocks, were used for decoration in a king's or duke's palace. The first guide of the Berlin Cabinet of Curiosities read, "Of all South American countries, Brazil is the one mostly wanted and visited by Prussian naturalists to whom our ethnographic collections owe many interesting and valuable objects," end of quote. While their natural science collections are well known, the smaller part of ethnographic objects often were forgotten and not studied at all. Such is the case with Johann Centurius Graf von Hofmannseck collection. He lived from 1766 to 1849, who sent his assistant or service and conservator, Friedrich Wilhelm Sieber, to Brazil in order to extend his collections. So the collection is registered under his name, but it was collected actually by a servant or conservator commissioned by him. From between 1800 and 1804, Sieber traveled and collected along the Amazon. He sent the huge collection of natural science specimens to Hofmannseck, who received them between 1806 to 1812. Among the ethnographic objects he collected from the Munduruku, there were 22 featherworks. But Hofmannseck was not interested in ethnographic objects and sold them to the Kunstkammer or Cabinet of Curiosities in 1888. As you can see, the colors have not changed at all. They have passed all these wars, World War I, World War II, and they're still in this condition. Now, I cannot talk about all the Brazilian collectors, natural scientists we have. I just give you a few examples to give you a sort of overview of what happened. Please don't blame me that I don't talk about Koch Grünberg or Prince Maximilian Neuwied, and I know there are many more. It's just a matter of time given here. So I decided for Friedrich Sello and Ignaz Olfers von Olfers. Sello lived between 1789 and 1831, and Olfers between 1793 and 1872. These two guys already show how important it was at that time that when you are traveling or doing research and you're doing together, you're really dependent from each other. These were adventurous trips. A lot of people did not survive them or they died early. So fortunately, these two guys did understand each other very well. They were able to travel for a while. And when Olfers, who was actually the boss of Sello, had to go back earlier to return to Germany, Sello was able to continue the trip and collect. So after he was able to send back most of his collections, he died not by an adventure or something, an illness or disease. No, he drank swimming in a river. So, yeah. There is a book that maybe some of you know, which is by Douglas Cole from '78, describing the scramble for Northwest Coast artifacts. I really like the book. However, I think one should restudy the question of competition. Douglas Cole does see all this with the topic of that there was a competition going on. Of course, there was a competition, but among many of these natural scientists, they were trying to get along in the best way possible. And maybe they already had this tradition because in the naturalist community, they would share collections. They would say, okay, I have more eagles than I need, so you get my eagle. Or you have more snakes than I need, so you get my snake. So they did not have this sort of competition. Why? They were collecting specimens. And these specimens could be changed, and they do that up to date. It's totally different with ethnographic collection, as you all know. So they were trying to collaborate, to do a cooperation, and that worldwide over between continents. I come now to a very exceptional case, and we're actually really proud of having this collection in Berlin, and we got it by coincidence. It was collected by Wilhelm Plitzker in 1880, and he heard, we don't know who he is, we don't know how he came to Brazil, we only know he was German, that's all. And he, by coincidence, heard in Rio Grande do Sul, which is in the south of Brazil, about a confiscation of an African collection of objects that were supposed to come directly from Africa, made in Africa, and used in rituals and ceremonies in the, what is the name? Forget it, the cult, the ritual cult. No, yeah, candomblé and the other orishas, with the orishas, okay, with the gods. So maybe some of these objects were even produced in Brazil, we don't know, but it shows that all over the country of Brazil, up to the very south, there were African objects in use. These are made of silver and different kind of materials. And today, these collections, there are not many of them, have found their way into even contemporary art, and they're very much estimated. And the collection is now more or less researched since we published it. I mean, this is all published. And but there are not many more around. Now I come to Richard Rode, who was hired by my predecessor, the founding director of the Berlin Museum, Adolphe Bastian, who traveled 7 years around the world, and he hired people abroad to do collection for him. Richard Rode lived between 1882 and 1886. He traveled all through Brazil, especially with the frontier to Paraguay. Actually, Bastian found him in Montevideo. And he also visited the Cadireo, and he bought collected objects from the Cadireo and many other groups. And only when I knew about Irina's talk, I added last minute on the right hand a drawing, or it's based on a photograph by Robert Limanice in 1892, who is a quite ambivalent, ambiguous person. On the one hand, he did fabulous language recordings. He did a lot of research. He collected everything. From that part was okay, but under a different name, he also did research on sexual customs among the natives he visited. And there is a sad story about a girl who died in a hospital by tuberculosis, and Limanice showed up, and he would divide her skeleton into single pieces, and the skull was sent directly to the Charité to Berlin for investigation by Virchow. And only in 1220, finally, the skull could be traced and sent back to the Cadivio, who did a funeral and honored that girl. So this is on YouTube. Anybody who is interested and goes on Lemanice and Cadivio will find the story. Yeah, but there's more about the Cadivio. Just an example what can happen. You see these wonderful motifs that were also put on coffee pots, coffee plates, and so on. And these were the results of a group of women, Cadivio women, who won a competition in Berlin in order to decorate. Here on the right-hand side, to decorate the poor houses, we say Plattenbau, from East Germany. This is the way they bought buildings in East Berlin, and they really look sad, and just put color on it would not be enough. So the Cadivio won that competition, and now on the front of these houses, they would do the Cadivio decoration that is already to be found in Richard Rode's objects from the 19th century. Yeah, then we have a break. Richard Rode was the last collector who was commissioned by a scholar and who did not do scholarly research by himself. With the two Xingu exhibitions by Karl von den Stein, everything changed. So he not only collected, he not only did these two very adventurous trips to the Xingu area, but he also did interviews with the people. He described their costume, their rituals. He tried to understand their way of thinking, and he left a wonderful, detailed description of everything. And he had the capacity not only to write for scholars, but also for the public. So his books sold very well. He had these wonderful drawings and photographs. And, you can see it was not easy to save the collections. But obviously he was treated very well by all the native groups he visited. And he was very afraid to find hostile people and not be able to do his work. But he could. Okay, so you see some of the objects he brought back to Berlin. It's 100 objects are still in Berlin. Like the other cases, like Rode and all the others, part of our collections have been lost. Not all arrived safely in Berlin. Yeah, we heard, I don't want to disappoint Adam. So here we have the sailors, but of course, please don't talk again, never again, about Eduard Seeler. Talk about Eduard and Cecilia. Eduard, as far as he knew him, would not have have the capacity to do the work without Cecilia, because Cecilia talked to the people. I mean, this stiff guy with all his stomach problems all the time, he was not able to talk to people. He was not able to convince people. He was not able, having polychrome pottery, this is women's stuff. You had to talk to women. And she was a photographer. So she was carrying all her photographic equipment with her. She was a botanist, so she was collecting insects. She was collecting botanical plants. So in the future, please, we talk about Eduard and Cecilia Seeler-Sachs. And she also was one of the first women with short hair. She was engaged in the feminist first groups in Berlin, so I feel obliged to tell you this. Cecilia. Okay, so this is one of the objects they brought to Berlin, and as I'm also specializing in Oaxaca, so most of these objects are from Oaxaca. And we are just finishing this book. It comes out maybe in July or August, which is just on one object, the Lienzo Seeler II, which is 4 meters to 4 meters. I don't know. It's a huge thing, you can imagine. I know especially people from the Leiden School in the Netherlands and others would like me to call this Kuslawakatu, and we also do this in parentheses. But it happens that you believe you have found the original place of an object, and you're sure it is Kuslawaka. You're very sure, but it happens you are wrong. We are sure about the collector. So is it such? I think we can name it Selatu. I mean, as long as it's accessible, I think we can do it. Yeah, now I turn to a very special case. Do I still have time? Oh, no. Just look at it. You may ask me questions about him, this textile merchant. He has 145. This is the way he collected. And his young wife was not really amused sleeping with him. Yeah. But, and I'm going to read this. Yeah, it's also, just to make you a bit curious. So in Hanover, his collection is in Hanover and Berlin. So in Hanover you have Don Luis, and I have studied a book-length study on him because actually I fall in love with him when I found him in Hanover. So I said, I will do some research on you. And the other is a series in Berlin. So these are from the same collection. And this guy, unfortunately, got bankrupt. It's like Manuel Martinez Casida, a local doctor, and he had to sell his collection, and he sold it to Bastian in Berlin. Again, all these networks. So, yeah. And I will conclude with different kind of media hold in the Ethnologisches Museum Berlin, the collection of early photographs and phonograph cylinders recordings from between 1893 and 1954, encompassing more than 16,000 original wax cylinders from all over the world. My example is a soundtrack taken by Martin Gosinde, who lived between 1886 and 1969, a German priest and ethnographer famous for his work in anthropology, particularly on the native groups of Tierra del Fuego, or Selknam, Yamana, and Halak Wulup between 1918 and 1924. He left an extensive documentation about the southernmost inhabitants of the earth being allowed to participate in initiation rites of the groups he studied. He left a well-known corpus of unique photographs, and on behalf of the Berlin Phonogram Archive, he recorded the songs and chants of the indigenous peoples. These are the sole surviving audio recordings of Tierra del Fuego Indians, or Yaman and Selknam. Okay. We are editing all our audio collections one after another, combining ethnographic documentary with specific description and explanation of the soundtrack of the instrument, and each CD comes with a text booklet. Conclusion. Europe is full of extensive collections from Latin America since the European so-called discovery of the continent. The earliest collections are of pre-Columbian origin. 100,000 of objects were collected all through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Mass collecting of ethnographic and archaeological objects stopped in the 1980s, more or less, for new regulation of national heritage protection and proceeding industrialization, replacing native material culture, aesthetic productions, and indigenous worldviews. Specializing scholars are busy to study the mass of collections on site. In my talk, I wanted to point to the impact of the old networks. Colleagues such as Adam Sellen and others, in the case of Mexico, have extensively studied the tracks on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. However, much more has to be done, as a digital age does allow us to unify collections, sources, and individuals to better understand the motivation behind the transfers between continents and places in the last 500 years. Thank you.
So our next speakers are giving a joint presentation. So I'll introduce them both, right? Okay, at the same time. So Dr. Megan O'Neill, a specialist in ancient Maya art and archaeology, is Associate Curator of the Art of the Ancient Americas at the LA County Museum of Art. She is the author of Engaging Ancient Maya Sculpture at Piedras Negras, Guatemala from 2012, Maya Art and Architecture, the second edition, and multiple essays on Maya and Mesoamerican art and histories of collecting and display. She curated the LACMA exhibition, Revealing Creation, The Science of Art and Ancient Maya Ceramics, which opened in May of 2016, and Forces of Nature, Divinity and the Arts of the Ancient Maya, which will tour China in 2018. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Fulbright, Dumbarton Oaks, the Getty Foundation, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery. Dr. Matthew Robb is Chief Curator of the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Prior to joining the staff at the Fowler, he was Curator of Arts of the Americas at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco and Associate Curator of the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas at the St. Louis Art Museum. He has also held curatorial positions at the Walters Art Museum and the Princeton University Art Museum. He has degrees from Princeton, UT Austin, and Yale Universities, and has lectured and written on a broad range of topics in the indigenous arts of the Western Hemisphere. 2 years ago, he was a scholar at the Getty Research Institute, where he carried out research on the stone masks of Teotihuacan. So first, we'll welcome Megan.
Thank you so much, Aleca, and to GRI, Tomas, and Kim, and Jennifer, and Marissa for inviting us to participate in this symposium featuring so many of our friends and colleagues. And it's really an honor to be with such distinguished fellow speakers as well as audience members. So our paper is definitively, oh, that's not our paper. That's our paper. Thank you. This is why I have a co-author. Okay. Our paper is definitively a work in progress, incorporating so Matthew and my independent and joint research into the history of the collecting and display of what has been called Pre-Columbian art, Pre-Hispanic art, or art of the ancient Americas. Today we explore the assemblage of museum and private collections and the organization of exhibitions of the arts of ancient Mexico in Mexico City and Los Angeles in the mid-20th century. We offer an episodic history, not a complete history, through an exploration of archival materials relating to the formation of individual and institutional collections in these two centers, and the actors, including archaeologists, museum employees, private collectors, and art dealers, involved in the acquisition, exchange, movement, and display of objects on both sides of the border. This was a moment when both Mexico City and Los Angeles witnessed the movement of collections from older buildings into new and modern spaces. Exhibition and museum catalogs of these moments present smooth histories, both of the ancient cultures they represent and of the contemporary institutions that generated them. But glimpses into the archive allow us to see the contingencies, collaborations, experiments, and conflicts behind the scenes, as some individuals and institutions work to expand the scope of their collections, and others made efforts to stem the trade of antiquities inside and outside of Mexico. So one of our key contributions is to trace the network of relationships among specific individuals who had developed an interest in these objects. Our cast of characters today includes Guillermo Echaniz, a well-known Mexican book dealer who at the same time was an exporter, or perhaps a smuggler, of ancient Mexican art, and the primary source for Earl Stendhal, an entrepreneurial art dealer in Los Angeles who sold European and Californian modern art. He started selling ancient Mexican art in 1935, and by the 1950s and 1960s, Pre-Columbian art had become his primary focus. One of his major activities, especially relevant to this conference, was developing museums as clients and developing venues for displaying this material. For better or for worse, most US museums might not have the collections of ancient American art they have today without Stendhal's activities and Echaniz's supply. Some of our information comes from preliminary forays into the Stendhal papers, which Ron and April Damon, third generation of the Stendhal galleries, have given us access before they are donated to the Getty Research Institute as the gallery's century of business comes to a close. Another character, one of Stendhal's major clients was Morton D. May, also known as Buster, president of the May Company department stores. May was a nationally known patron of the arts who acted as both collector and vendor of ancient American materials through his donations to various museums, especially the St. Louis Art Museum, alongside and overlapping with purchases and sales of that same material in his stores, including the branch on Wilshire and Fairfax here in Los Angeles, next to LACMA. And we are looking into May's communications with Doctora Beatriz Barba de Piñachan, Mexico's first official female archaeologist, who was the founder and subdirector of Mexico's National Museum of Cultures, formed in the wake of the move of the National Museum of Anthropology from Calle Moneda, downtown, to Chapultepec in 1964. Although these individuals would be at the center of the histories we described today, there are many more individuals who played key roles in these stories, especially Mexican museographer Fernando Gamboa and collectors and dealers in Mexico and the US, like Miguel Covarrubias, Vincent Price, and William Spratling, to name a few. They were part of a transnational elite who collected and displayed art in Los Angeles and Mexico City during a time in which institutions in both cities looked to expand their worldview and position themselves and their audiences in a more global environment through the possession and exchange and display of these objects. Now, a word about exchange. Exchanges can take place between individuals, between institutions, and among individuals and institutions. For our purposes, the term exchange encompasses any transaction involving objects, actions like buying, donating, trading, lending, and smuggling. Of course, there's slippage among these terms, and we may get flack for this. Some may object to placing international exchanges between museums on the same spectrum as personal exchanges between individuals. But this more capacious definition allows us to analyze the extent of the overlaps among different networks that were clearly connected. Looking at these transactions more broadly encourages us to study the full scope of the movement of objects, regardless of their origin or destination. Some of the networks and exchanges will seem surprising, if not shocking, from today's perspective. In some cases, it's clear the participants knew they were engaging in clandestine and likely illegal actions. And in others, the exchanges took place against a broader backdrop of diplomatic and economic relationships between nations. But in some cases, the key personalities are the same, which suggests one main difference is transparency in the transaction. How many people knew about the exchange, and how well documented was it? Also relevant, of course, are mid-20th century changes in local, regional, national, and international understandings of private versus public ownership of cultural and/or national patrimony. Now, the rich histories and intersecting developments of archaeology and museums in Mexico have been meticulously researched, notably by scholars such as Enrique Florescano, Leonardo Lopez Lujan, Maruna Achim, and two of our speakers today, Miguel Ángel Fernández and Adam Sellin. They've described the various epochs of 16th and century Spanish Catholic destruction and hiding of Aztec monuments and buildings, and the later recovery, appreciation, and appropriation of these monuments and images for Spanish Creole and post-independence Republic, Porfirian, and post-revolutionary identities. Located physically on top of the ancient capital of Tenochtitlan, residents and governments in Mexico City could hardly ignore the physical remains of the great Aztec capital. And more so, they become foundations for nation building. And as Adam has outlined, parallel activities were taking place outside the capital in the Yucatan and elsewhere. Even at this early stage of development, international exchanges, as several of our speakers have already shown, international exchanges and contacts proved crucial to institutional practice in Mexico. As Achim has discussed, the first director of Mexico's National Museum, Isidro Ignacio de Icaza, saw the surfeit of available antiquities and the dearth of examples of exotic natural history as an opportunity to exchange one for the other. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the National Museum's inventories also included objects collected by explorers and private citizens, and museum staff occasionally purchased them. Matthew, can I have some water? Sorry, that's why you have a co-author. Well, he's getting it, thank you. In the decades, after the revolution, National Museum staff also sought ways to improve the institution's organization and build and diversify their collections to more accurately reflect the breadth of ancient Mexico. A 1936 letter that I found in the INA archives cites the need to hire a competent archaeologist and make, quote, a dignified Maya collection by exchanging duplicate objects. And in 1939, INA, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, was founded to protect, conserve, and study Mexico's artistic, ethnographic, and archaeological patrimony. Indeed, in these years, Mexico's relationship with antiquities was becoming more systematized and understood in relation to science, particularly to anthropology, with more attention given to protection and study, which is an important backdrop for the stories that we will tell. At the same time, an active market for Mexican antiquities steadily grew on both sides of the border. And two of our key figures helped shape the mid-20th century market, and for better or worse, helped create and stimulate the appetite for ancient Mexican objects in the United States. Los Angeles gallerist and art dealer Earl Stendahl and Mexico City antiquarian Guillermo Echaniz. April Damon recounts in her recent biography that Stendahl turned his entrepreneurial talents to art sales starting in the 19-teens, and he is well known for bringing modern art to Los Angeles, including Picasso's Guernica in 1939. Joined by his son, Alfred, son-in-law Joe Damon, and grandson Ron Damon, he established an extremely successful gallery that sold to myriad private collectors and museums. What we want to focus on is how he worked to advance and increase the collecting of pre-Columbian art in the US at mid-century, at a scale not seen before, as far as we know, though Berlin might rival that. With Stendahl building private and museum collections all over the country through an extensive program of touring exhibitions and associated sales. It's clear from published records, particularly museum catalogs, that the Stendahl galleries were innovative and entrepreneurial in the realm of pre-Columbian art museum exhibitions. This was not necessarily in the realm of display or design, but in the mounting of exhibitions in diverse contexts in Southern California and elsewhere. For example, at the Los Angeles County Museum, Otis Arts Institute, Scripps College, as well as more unexpected venues like the Gimbel Brothers Department Store and the Texas State Fair. One of the first such museum projects in which Stendahl participated was the 1940 Pre-Columbian Art exhibition at the LA County Museum, involving dealers such as Stendahl and Joseph and Ernest Brummer, collectors like Robert Woods Bliss and Walter and Louise Ahrensberg, both Stendahl clients, and institutions such as the Middle American Research Institute at Tulane, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Brooklyn Museum, some of the earliest and oldest collections of pre-Columbian material in the United States. 1940, of course, was the same year as MoMA's 20 Centuries of Mexican Art, organized by Nelson Rockefeller with Alfonso Caso, Miguel Covarrubias, and other Mexican luminaries, which displayed antiquities from Mexico's national collections along with Mexican art from later periods. These two exhibitions set the model for later exhibitions sponsored by Mexico on the one hand, and the dealer-collector shows on the other that would propagate through US institutions in the coming decades. The Stendhal papers give us additional glimpses into these efforts, clearly showing that Stendhal was very active in developing museum collections by working to convince curators from various departments like anthropology, decorative arts, ancient arts, to buy art of the ancient Americas, which otherwise had no real departmental home in most institutions. These include the Worcester Museum, Rochester, Los Angeles County Museum, Tulane, Fogg Museum, Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and municipal museums in St. Louis and Denver. Turning these curators and institutions into pre-Columbian art collectors was a way to popularize these materials and also to make money, plain and simple, both as profit and to invest in inventory and grow the business. The papers also clearly show that the mounting of exhibitions was not just about educating the public, which it was, and that was the main rationale provided in the catalogs, but also about cultivating clients and making sales. Many of the private collectors in turn developed their own parallel or distinct relationships with institutions, making it quite plausible to say that without Stendhal's involvement, many collections and institutions probably wouldn't have pre-Columbian collections. Two major private clients, as mentioned before, were Ahrensburg and Bliss, who were exacting customers looking for the finest material. Their collections later would be donated to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and Dumbarton Oaks, respectively. But the high end of the market left a lot of material behind. Finding clients who would buy less expensive items meant seeding other dealers, including Karl Nierendorf and Pierre Matisse in New York, and later, people like Morton May, who, through his department stores, would be able to sell in larger quantities at low prices. Although Stendhal did buy from several suppliers in Mexico, including William Spratling, Guillermo Echaniz was a major source of the Stendhal material. There's little published on Echaniz, except for some brief mentions by Michael Coe and April Damon. But from his shop on 12 Donceles in downtown Mexico City, and later in the Popotla neighborhood, Echaniz sold historic books and made and sold facsimiles of pre-Hispanic and colonial period codices. In a 1976 interview, Al Stendhal recalled that Echaniz had visited Los Angeles seeking a buyer for an early Mexican printing press. Earl Stendhal, Al's dad, took Echaniz to meet Ahrensburg, who, aside from his interest in modern and pre-Columbian art, had an avid interest in Francis Bacon. Perhaps Stendhal saw an opportunity to connect to bibliophiles. But it was Ehrenberg's ancient Mexican objects that caught Echaniz's eyes. Quote, "And my father," Earl Stendhal, this is Al speaking, "had seen these, and he might have taken this fellow, Echaniz, up to meet Mr. Ehrenberg, and he said, 'Oh, I can get things like this.' And my father said, 'We'll get some.' Laughter. It was as simple as that because nobody knew what it all was." Close quote. This proved to be the beginning of a mutually beneficial relationship. In multiple letters preserved in the Stendhal papers, Echaniz writes with details of possible new sources of antiquities, including government and military officials in Colima and Campeche, and with tips for getting around customs officials, including using friends and other ruses. These activities constituted major business for both parties during World War II, as letters between the two men and the growing collections around the US after the war attest. They presumably masked this business by exporting other things, like books and modern Mexican art. But Echaniz also was contributed to building museum displays and collections inside Mexico. In 1946, he organized an exhibition of ancient West Mexican art at the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, and his entrepreneurial spirit extended to both creating high-quality facsimiles of Mexican codices and colonial documents for libraries around the world, as well as bringing antiquities from elsewhere into Mexico. In particular, the INA archives include documents comprising Echaniz's request to import a large collection of Asian antiquities from Los Angeles, presumably from Stendhal. Now, a letter in the Stendhal papers acknowledges this effort And so that's Bill is Echani's effort, and mentions his preparations to send a large collection of Maya things to Stendhal. So in the realm of international art exchange then, Echani's was sending Mexican antiquities out of Mexico and bringing Asian antiquities into Mexico, and working also with Stendhal. This, of course, was another opportunity for business, but it also may be seen as a way of expanding perspectives, within Mexico, of allowing Mexican citizens to encounter antiquities from other lands, at times also a priority for the National Museum, something we'll get to again later. The archives reveal that Echani's and Stendhal were aware of the problems and what they were doing, for they exchanged letters with advice, again, about how to get past customs and warning each other to watch out for people like Alfonso Caso, who were trying to impede looting and smuggling of materials out of Mexico. But the existence of US collections of Mexico material was not a secret. Scholars and collectors like Felipe Carrillo Gil in Yucatan knew about the Stendhal galleries and the Ahrensburg collection. Carrillo Gil denounced both looting and government neglect of antiquities and encouraged the development of adequate exhibition venues and donations of private collections to the nation. He also stated he purchased antiquities expressly so they would not be sold outside the country. In fact, there was a market for antiquities in these decades on both sides of the border. But by mid-century, especially as Mexico was planning to build the new Anthropology Museum in Chapultepec Park, the idea of private collecting became increasingly problematic. Even the idea of taking materials from other Mexican states for the new Mexico City Museum was critiqued by Carrillo Gil and others. And one 1964 newspaper article called such transfers a form of saqueo, or looting, likening these activities to ones perpetrated by smugglers removing objects from the country. I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Oh, no. Together. Co-authored. Mexico at this time was working to build not just adequate but spectacular exhibition venues, and also innovating in the display of pre-Columbian art around the world, most notably under the energetic leadership of Fernando Gamboa, one of the founders of Mexico's Institute of Fine Arts in 1947. And here you see him forth from the, go back, pointer. Right there. Yeah. Gamboa borrowed the concept of the 1940 MoMA show to mount several exhibitions featuring Mexican art from pre-Columbian times to the present in European museums in the early 1950s and at the 1958 Expo in Brussels, and then in a series of shows, as you can see here, called Masterworks of Mexican Art in European Cities and then Los Angeles from 1959 to 1964. The pre-Columbian section featured mostly objects from Mexican national collections, but also some from private collections, a few of which were eventually absorbed into that national collection. Now, this is an enormous amount of bibliographic work that Megan and Mary Miller have done, tracing these intersecting and overlapping exhibition programs. So in another paper forthcoming this fall, Megan and Mary Miller discuss these exhibitions and the contemporaneous and competing exhibitions organized by the Stendhal galleries, clients, and colleagues, whose exhibitions included artworks that were for sale, and some of which were sold, as well as objects borrowed from European museum collections. Here you see two of the catalogs. The two series of shows displayed collections that were in some ways so different from each other, Mexican national patrimony versus almost explicit commodities, yet both had objects from private collections. In other ways, they were complementary, for one had covered all of Mexico and parts of Central America, and the other extended chronologically into the present. Both had multiple venues in Europe, and in some venues, in Vienna and Zurich and Berlin at least, the shows actually merged. However, the shows did actually split, and Megan and Mary argue that Mexico's discomfort with gallery sales comprised the wedge that drove them apart in 1960. The Mexico show subsequently would come to Los Angeles, to the newly incorporated LACMA, split from the Los Angeles County Museum, but still located in Exposition Park, It was an important binational event, as you saw from that slide before, Mexico's former president, Miguel Alemán, attending open events alongside Stendhal clients. Meanwhile, the Stendhal galleries had exhibitions in Los Angeles and the greater Southern California area of objects for sale. It's hard not to think that both sets of exhibition tours increased the desire for collecting ancient Mexican art in this time. The series of Mexican exhibitions in Europe and then Los Angeles was a grand tour that introduced Mexico and Mexican art from all periods to the world, before these pieces were then installed in several new museums, the Anthropology Museum that you see here, Museum for Colonial Art, and the Modern Art Museum in 1964. The National Museum of Anthropology garnered the most attention due to its monumental scale and strikingly modern design that elegantly incorporated references to pre-Columbian architecture. When the Anthropology Museum moved to Chapultepec, the Calle Moneda building that the museum had occupied for a century was left vacant. There were actually plans to turn it over to the Secretaría de la Hacienda, but INA did not want to lose this historic structure. In addition, as the new Anthropology Museum's rapidly changing museography came to emphasize Mexican collections only, thus not including materials from other cultures that had become part of their collections over the years. These two situations created an opportunity to inaugurate a new museum in the Moneda building, the Museo Nacional de las Culturas, comparable to the Museum of Man in Paris, again, that French model that we heard so much about in earlier papers. A stated motivation was that such a museum would allow Mexicans to compare themselves with the rest of the world. Indeed, according to Eusebio Dávalos Hurtado, director of INA, the lack of a global museum in Mexico resulted in, quote, ignorance that isolates us from the rest of humanity, end quote. Comparable to the Anthropology Museum's need for more collections in a new, larger space, the Museo de las Culturas also needed more objects to fill their building. As Beatriz Barba de Pinachan recounts in the book published on the occasion of the museum's opening, they responded by purchasing and accepting donations of archaeological and ethnographic material from around the world, from public institutions, embassies in Mexico, as well as private collectors and art dealers, some outside of Mexico. Mexican officials like Ignacio Bernal, then director of the Museo Nacional de Antropología, and Barba de Pinachan also actively sought trades with foreign museums and collectors. One person that they turned to was Morton D. May. By the mid-1960s, May was nationally known both for his business acumen and the May Company, as the May Company department stores steadily expanded, and as a patron of the arts, as he served on local, regional, and national boards. The May Company's nationwide reach, coupled with May's desire to develop new markets, had led him to develop sales of non-Western art that toured May Company stores around the United States. As we've seen with Stendhal and the Gimbel brothers, the idea of selling fine art and even pre-Columbian art in department stores was not especially new. But May was uniquely well positioned, with store branches in major metropolitan areas where museums were newly enthusiastic about collecting and displaying pre-Columbian art. Places like Denver and St. Louis, where Stendhal had already been working to seed the market with institutional clients. This is the background to a series of letters from April 1964 to February 1965 that reveals how May, Bernal, and Barba de Pinachan explored both outright purchases from May's collection and from the department store's collection, as well as exchanges of Mexican archaeological material for objects from cultures that Mexico could not otherwise access, particularly, as May offers here, African art and ancient Mediterranean antiquities. This exchange for pre-Columbian objects ultimately did not come to fruition, and it's not immediately clear why, given exchanges that the Penn Museum had made that traded Near Eastern antiquities for objects from Teotihuacan, as well as this long history of similar exchanges over the course of the National Museum's history that we've discussed. It's possible that May's request was not seriously entertained, and that Barba de Pinachan simply resolved it with a polite redirection to other possibilities which did succeed. For instance, May is listed as a donor in the book and also as a donor of this Inuit mask in particular in the museum's first catalog in 1964. So while we can't say exactly why the conversation shifted, it almost certainly had something to do with May being seen as a US art dealer, and also with changing perception of Mexican antiquities as national and cultural patrimony and central to national identity. Indeed, May was not just any art dealer, but both a client and a business partner with the Stendhal Galleries in Los Angeles, whose business selling pre-Columbian art in the mid-1960s was still thriving. The market was large enough that in the summer of 1966, May brought a touring exhibition/sale of pre-Columbian art from the flagship Famous Bar store in Clayton, Missouri, to other May Company department store branches, including the one on Wilshire and Fairfax. LACMA's new buildings had opened just down the street in 1965, creating a curious adjacency where pre-Columbian art was available for viewing and sale in a department store, but not in Los Angeles' newest art museum, which did not display pre-Columbian art in its early years. News reports of the time suggest that the sale here at the May Company store included more than 4,000 items. And in fact, the Stendhal papers revealed a letter dated August 1965 in which May agrees to pay the Stendhal galleries $95,000, and that's about $735,000 today, for 2,350 pre-Columbian objects. This is new evidence from the Stendhal Gallery's archive that adds further depth to understanding this network of exchanges that existed at this time and how these objects were moving around and where they were destined to go. We find these overlaps and adjacencies fascinating, since it's very difficult, obviously, to imagine them happening with pre-Columbian material today. But if we look at the actions of Stendhal and his colleagues more critically, can we consider this episodic history another birth of museums, not in Latin America, but of ancient Latin America, and in Southern California, physically close and culturally aligned with Mexico, and arguably within a larger conceptual framework of Latin America as well? This is not necessarily an unvarnished good. The mid-20th century was a period of interrogation of how, why, and where to collect and display the ancient arts of Mexico, whether it be in art museums or anthropology museums or history museums, world culture museums, and these questions remain very relevant today. There were obviously dramatic changes in the late 1960s in the perception and the legality of collecting pre-Columbian art in Mexico and in the United States, and as pressure increased to address the rapid rise in looting, particularly at Maya sites in southern Mexico and northern Guatemala. We argue that we actually need to study these histories of institutional collections and dealers and collectors, wherever they may lead us, so that we can actually better understand the nature of the museum collections that we work with. Indeed, we need to acknowledge that the roots of pre-Columbian objects in US art museums, if not indeed in art history as a discipline as well, lie in the market. The work of Stendhal, Echanes, and contemporaries cultivated the presence of pre-Columbian objects in these museums and also in people's homes. We might say that their purported elevation of this material to the status of art and an attendant focus on form and aesthetics, separated from culture or meaning, also encouraged or enabled a decontextualizing of these objects that allowed them to be seen as commodities available for sale in department stores, high-end private galleries, and on display in collectors' homes and museums. In this context, it's not about the person or culture that made the object, but about an idea of an object and the inscription of new meaning onto it. And what's so crucial for us, of course, is to continue uncovering these histories and to exchange research and ideas, as this conference is demonstrating, among people and institutions across these borders. Thank you.